Well, welcome everybody. I hope everybody's recharged with coffee, tea, water, whatever, ready for the last two papers of the day. It's been a fantastic conference. It really has been a keynote conference, John. And like everybody else, I'd like to extend my thanks to all those who've been doing the hard work, in particular, those at the table by the door. Thank you. I'm also really grateful to John for involving me in this and giving me the chance to introduce a couple of old friends, Manuel, Fernández-Götz and Rubina. Each of them is an amazingly prolific scholar. Those who are lucky enough to get their off-prints regularly and e-prints will have vast areas of their hard disks devoted to their publications. And they are wonderful publications, and they're both in quite different ways, as you're going to see, transform the fields in which they work. And so really looking forward to hearing the latest talks that they give. They're also, thinking about some of the comments made last night, model collaborators. A vast amount of the work that Rubina and her colleagues in Copenhagen and at Jerash and others have done is genuine collaboration and bringing on new people to the field. And Manuel as well has got an enormous network of people he's worked with across Europe and now beyond, which is nice for us. So you can be model collaborators to us, bringing out that virtue that people identified in the last session yesterday. Looking forward very much to hearing your papers. So we're going to start with Manuel. Manuel Fernández-Götz, who was once a colleague of mine in Scotland as the Abercrombie Professor at the University of Edinburgh, is now Professor of Later European Prehistory at the University of Oxford. In Edinburgh, he served as the head of the archaeology department, and among his main research areas are late prehistoric and Roman societies in Europe, topics such as the archaeology of early cities, migrations, before they were trendy, conflict archaeology. He's carried out fieldwork in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Spain, Croatia. He has authored over 250 publications. His research has been recognised by various distinctions and awards, including the Philip Leverhulme Prize, which in the UK is given every 3 years to the most promising people in the field, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Thomas Reid Medal. Manuel, we're looking forward very much to hearing you. Take it
away. Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks, Greg, for the kind introduction. And obviously, many thanks to John for organizing this wonderful conference. The papers have been really inspiring, both yesterday with the panel discussion and all the presentations today. So I'm certainly learning a lot, and I'm really enjoying this. So I'm covering the uncomfort table. I'm going to be looking a bit more into what I call the dark sides of the past. And usually I start with presenting a bit the big picture, then some case studies, and end up with larger reflections again. Today I'm doing it a bit different. I'm actually starting this journey at an early Iron Age hillfort in western Slovakia. And I hope it makes sense as the presentation develops. So this is a site which I, by the way, hope to visit later this year that has seen research for a relatively long time. It's a hill fort of around 12 hectares and occupied in the 7th, 6th centuries BC, but probably the most spectacular evidence that was recovered by the excavations there are nearly 400 so-called Scythian-type arrowheads. Most of them were found at the gates and in their vicinity. And I want to say here, I'm using this term Scythian just as a sort of broad umbrella term to refer to a wide diversity of groups that have their origins in the steppe regions or are strongly shaped by these connections. But I'm not using it in any kind of ethnic sense. In addition to these finds of the arrowheads, there's also evidence for an enormous conflagration, and several human skeletons have been found here, which led the excavators already a long time ago to suggest that this site was attacked by foreign troops, an interpretation that more recent research seems to confirm. And particularly, Anja Helmuth has done a lot of work on this site and other similar ones that were subject to similar forms of violence. And here, just an idea, some distribution of arrowheads along the fortification and in other areas. Some of the arrowheads here were still stuck into the outside face of the wall when found during the excavation, and many of them show damage also from hitting the stone wall, so clearly, again, emphasizing this attack. The site seems to have been intentionally burned down to the ground after the attack. There has been some debate about the chronology of this event and also others, and I will come back to this in a moment, but nowadays, most scholars agree that this event would have taken place in the second half of the 6th century BC. So why is this relevant? I mean, it's relevant obviously at the site level, but it also has wider implications because this site is just one of many settlements in Central Eastern Europe where these so-called Scythian-type arrowheads have been discovered, something that has been known for a long time, but in recent years has seen a sort of revival in terms of new research. So these are small winged arrowheads cast in bronze, and at least in some cases, I don't want to say in all because there are also some other alternative explanations, but at least in some cases, they are reflecting raids by armed mounted troops. This is a topic that has, there's a long scholarly interest in this since the 19th century. Obviously, interpretations have fluctuated over time, also in accordance to large interpretative trends in archaeology. The initial idea was, well, this kind of finds show military attacks, raids, and so on. Then there was a counter-reaction to this models. However, more recent research is is going back in some way to some of the older ideas, showing that, in fact, many of these artifacts seem to belong to a rather compact chronological horizon. So, whereas for a while it was said, well, these are things, these destruction events or so, they spread over like a longer period of time in the 7th and 6th century BC. It seems now that most of them actually belong to a rather close horizon. So, and there is also new research going on, discovering new sites that show evidence for the violent destruction of the sites by horse-borne Scythian archers. Another example is very recent research is this site in Hungary, a very large hill fort. I'm not going to try to attempt to pronounce the name. I did it once and probably didn't go very well, but it's an amazing site. The investigations over the last 10, 15 years have discovered a large amount, again, of the Scythian-type arrowheads. Over 230 were discovered in 2011, and an entrance on the southern wall of the hill fort, and then more recent campaigns that are still going on by colleagues from Hungary and also collaborations with other countries and discovering more arrowheads and also burned buildings and human remains. And this is a very spectacular image here that comes from the site by Sabo and his team. They're, again, particularly concentrating area immediately outside the fortification, showing traces of damage from hitting the wall, clearly showing a massive scale attack. And in both these sites where we have like hundreds of these arrowheads, obviously this is only a small part because only small areas have been excavated. So what's the bigger picture of this site? So these are just two prominent examples, but there are many more in areas of Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Austria. So recent reassessment by people like Louis Nebelsic, and the first part of my presentation is based on his recent work. Recent reassessment shows that for Central Eastern Europe, most of these raidings towards the west was a rather short-lived phenomenon concentrated in the second half of the 6th century BC. Probably we're speaking of a time span of about one generation, two at the maximum. And we are seeing here evidence, large-scale evidence for Eastern European mounted archers from the steppe region launching incursions into parts of Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Austria, and Poland. There is also considerable diversity. There's a much longer story about this. Some areas where we see these contacts already developed for a long time, and others where we just see like this short-term but quite damaging attack. So there's regional diversity, but in some regions, these destruction horizons were followed by a drastic reduction in settlement activity. So looking at regional settlement patterns, a huge decrease in the aftermath of these events. How far west these raids went is a matter of debate, but I want to show here the site of the Honeyburg because, as some of you know, this is a site in southwest Germany, a large agglomeration from the early Iron Age. I have worked there for many years in collaboration with various German colleagues. There is a big destruction event in the second half of the 6th century BC with the destruction of the Mediterranean-inspired Madrig Wall. And well, there has been a lot of debate about what were the causes for this and these changes. I'm not going into detail. I just want to highlight an interpretation that a colleague from Ukraine, Denis Grechko, who has done a lot of recent work on Discussion raids, he has proposed that the Honeywell might have been destroyed as part of one of these raids, and probably the westernmost ones. Well, he's linking it in wide interpretations of these horizons of raids to the west, but also he's pointed to the relatively recent find of Western Halcha trophies at Bilsk, a very important site in Ukraine. So these are belts that are characteristic from the West Hallstatt region, like southwest Germany, and so you find them in elite graves there, but then they appear in a grave in Ukraine. So why is that the case? So he interprets them as trophies as part of some of these expeditions. I must say this is obviously not confirmed. Actually, we only have 3 of these kind of arrowheads at Honeywell, which is very little so far. But nonetheless, I'm not sure if this was the case, but I do think at least it's an interesting hypothesis. We do have also, just as a sort of historical analogy, we know in the medieval period that several historically documented raids going into these regions along the corridor of the Danube. And actually, the archaeological evidence in many cases for that is actually less than you have for this kind of Iron Age stuff. But we have historical sources. So anyway, so these are phenomena that you can explain through communication routes and so on. But moving a step further about why is this happening, if we have much better chronological evidence now, and the evidence points to that most of these raids seem to have happened in a relatively close chronological horizon, what's the cause of this? So Louis Nebelsic and some other colleagues have interpreted this as something related to targeted slaving expeditions. Some areas were particularly affected, Lower Silesia, parts of Great Poland and East Lusatia, and nearly all of the early Iron Age strongholds in these regions were either abandoned or burned, followed by a substantial depopulation of entire landscapes. They were obviously not completely empty, but there seems to be, as far as we can say from archaeological record, a substantial decline in the aftermath of these events. And it is likely that the profound demographic impact of this and other regions was due to massive taking of captives to be sold as slaves in expanding Black Sea markets. And here's kind of some of the maps that have been produced about this western expansion of what Louis Nebelsic calls slaving zones in the 6th century BC. And this has been interpreted as a sort of predatory raiding, which large-scale commercial enduring slaving that was triggered, among other things, by increasing monetization of the economies of the Black Sea region in the 6th century BC. And Nebelsic calls this a key shift towards the systematic commercialization of humans as chattel. The demand by Greek states and Near Eastern powers would have led to a veritable hunt for slaves in some regions that had dramatic effects on many of these communities. We see this not only in the destruction of sites and the demographic impact, but also in changes in local power relations or even the break of certain cultural traditions that we see in these regions. Again, I want to emphasize it's not all the regions. There are differences, but this difference can be explained very well in most cases by looking at the period before, which areas were already had close contacts, others not, and also questions of topography and landscape and so on. In any case, this phenomenon has also been compared with the effects, on a smaller scale, of course, of the transatlantic slave trade. In any case, starting with the picture of this small hill fort in Slovakia, we see that we can only understand the developments happening in this time in the early Iron Age in temperate Europe, looking at a much wider picture. We need to look at the micro scale of the site itself, then we need to look at the mesoscale of regional settlement patterns, but we will not understand this if we don't look at the wider picture of things happening in the Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean. And obviously this topic of slaving and captives and so is something that has a long tradition of scholarship with many prominent works, like the classical book by Finlay, and more recent ones like this one by Cameron, which I found very inspiring, Captives, How Stolen People Change the World. And I also want to draw attention to this paper by Tim Taylor, who kind of questions what he considers that many scholars have underestimated just the amount of slaves that were actually there. Like sometimes written sources often refer to enormous quantities, and scholars tend to say, well, this is exaggeration. Well, in some cases it might be exaggerations, but he actually makes some plausible arguments for the massive thing. Obviously, slavery will have existed already for a longer time, and we have evidence for that, but it's the scale that increases. This topic of violence and slaving has also been explored in recent years by other colleagues in other chronological and geographical contexts. For example, there's a very interesting paper by Rebecca Redfern, who has done amazing work in terms of looking at bioarchaeology of Iron Age and Roman Britain. And she actually published in 2020 an article called Iron Age Predatory Landscapes. And she was studying evidence for captive taking and enslaving in Iron Age Britain. Obviously, it's not an easy task, but putting together methodologies that have been applied for other areas of the world, including North America, and looking at different sorts of evidence, I think she comes up with some very interesting conclusions. She speaks here of predatory landscapes, and quoting her, as the practice of captives taken and enslaved in shapes and negotiates how different communities engage and connect socially, economically, and politically. The evidence for this can range from metal chains and restraints, the ones we can see here from Southeast England, to the emptying, well, not complete emptying, but partial emptying of certain landscapes, injuries on human skeletons, and skewed sex ratios. These things, if you look at them individually, most of them, I mean, the chains are a bit more clear. Many of these other things, we don't really have like a proof that it was always related to slaving, but I think putting different sorts of evidence together, at least you can construct some plausible scenarios. And towards the very end of the Iron Age, there also seems to be an export of slaves to the expanding Roman world. And that brings me now to the second half of my presentation, which is looking at the impact of the Roman conquest on indigenous communities. I have worked with colleagues on this for over a decade now, and as some of you might know, in 2020 we published a paper in Antiquity, a discussion paper we called The Dark Side of the Empire. And there we defined Roman expansionism in the late Republic and early Empire as a predatory regime political economy. And we follow here the definition provided by Alfredo González Ruibal, who applied this concept to colonial Africa. And he was in turn following Mbembe, describing predatory regimes as being characterized by the militarization of power and trade, pillage as an economic strategy, the pursuit of private interest under public command, and the conversion of brute violence into legitimate authority. And in this period, Rome's foreign policy was largely driven by the personal interests of elite factions and individuals who were using military campaigns and destruction of the external resources as a means of increasing their own wealth and prestige. Julius Caesar being a very clear example of this, how he used the campaign for his own personal gain. But there are many others before and after him. And we were taking inspiration by some work done by decolonial scholars, particularly South American decolonial scholars, and publications like Walter Mignolo, who has published books like The Darker Side of Western Modernity or The Darker Side of the Renaissance, or Aníbal Quijano with his concept of the coloniality of power. And in a way, we wanted to contribute a bit to these ongoing debates that are shared by many scholars coming from different perspectives on decolonizing Roman studies, trying to challenge the traditional dominant narratives that have emphasized the so-called bright aspects, from the spread of literacy to villa landscapes, public architecture, high-quality table wares, and so on. I grew up mainly in southern Spain, and there, I mean, I grew up like always learning in school and university about, well, this wonderful Roman architecture. You see all these mosaics and the amphitheaters, and it was so advanced, and it brought so many things. And this kind of civilization and narratives obviously have been very pervasive. They have a very long tradition in different parts. But I'm not denying that this is part of the story, but there are many other sides to the story that we need to consider. So by conceptualizing the expanding Roman state as a predatory system, we aim to contribute to decolonizing Roman studies by paying more attention to the darker sides of imperialism, trying to develop a more inclusive account, making visible those left behind the process of conquest, and drawing attention to the mechanisms of imperial domination, mechanisms that you can see both inside the Roman state, but also in its campaigns and policy towards the outside. And in that sense, I think that it's important that we, as modern scholars, that we are careful not to sanitize the past, particularly because actually Romans were quite explicit about their use of mass violence. We have it in written sources, we have it in iconography. For example, here, destruction of a Germanic village by Roman troops during the Marcomannic Wars. It's an image that I quite like because, I mean, kind of horrible thing that is depicting, but I think it shows you many things that will leave no archaeological trace or very rarely leave an archaeological trace, but that are part of this campaign, the campaigns taking captives, raping people, burning houses, killing animals, taking animals, stuff like that. Obviously, there's a great diversity in terms of Roman expansionism. There's a lot of negotiation with local elites, alliances, and so on. But there are cases of extreme violence. And I, in my own work, just as a matter of chance, I think over the years, I focused particularly on the northern regions like northern Gaul, northern Spain, now northern Britain. And we have many examples of imperial brutality in these northern regions. For example, Caesar in his war against the Eburones from northern Gaul said that the campaigns were meant to annihilate these people and its name. Cassius Dio, for example, speaking about Severus' invasion of Caledonia in the early 3rd century AD, said that the emperor instructed his troops to spare no one, not even the unborn in its mother's womb, and to leave no one alive to memorialize the dead. As Laban has stated in a recent publication, the empire's capacity to destroy was regularly evoked and celebrated. Mass destruction was authorized above all by the discourse of barbarism. In such situations, annihilation seemed not only justified but necessary. Obviously, classical sources should not be taken for granted. We need to analyze them critically, and not all authors are the same, and not all contexts are the same. At the same time, we should also be careful not to dismiss them just as literary topoi or exaggerations. And I think that ignoring and underplaying the brutality that they often describe very explicitly is also a way of dehumanizing the conquered, not take it seriously what will have happened to these people. There has also been quite a bit of discussion if concepts such as genocide and ethnocide can be applied to antiquity, the varying opinions, but there has been a lot of work in recent in the last 15, 20 years of actually scholars looking at this phenomenon in the past from a cross-cultural perspective. Genocide is generally defined as a practice involving the mass killing of a national, ethnic, or religious group in combination with the intent, successful or otherwise, to annihilate that group, whereas ethnocide has been described as the destruction of a group's culture and identity without the physical massacre of its people. And while some scholars have argued that it's anachronistic to apply this to the ancient world, I think as a cross-cultural taking a cross-cultural perspective, we can have interesting studies, and I do think it's applicable. In fact, one of my former Edinburgh colleagues, Donald Bloxham, he's one of the editors of the Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies. He doesn't have any problem about applying this to ancient times. In fact, it has been one of the chapters in that Oxford Handbook states that the history of European literature begins with an account of a genocide, the destruction of the city of Troy and its people. And just to quote briefly what Agamemnon told his brother Menelaus, not a single one of them must escape sheer destruction at our hands, not even if a mother carries one in her belly and his mate, not even he should escape. Altogether, they must be exterminated from Troy, their bodies untended and invisible. I'm not going to go here into debates of historicity or not or so, but it's just like if people are describing this, this was a thinking that was not alien to them. So when it comes to the Roman conquest specifically, obviously there has been a long-standing research on Roman military infrastructure, and so on. But in the dominant paradigm of so-called limes archaeology, the archaeology of Roman frontiers, the Roman army has traditionally been seen as the defender of peace and civil life in the provinces against external barbarian enemies. So we are in the post-conquer period. The Roman are building fortifications that defend themselves from the barbarians. But if we look at the moment of the Roman conquest itself, then we see a different picture. Then we see the Roman army in its role as the aggressor associated with mass violence, enslavement, sometimes even genocide. I don't think these perspectives are incompatible. They're showing different sides of the same coin and also different chronological moments, the conquest itself versus post-conquest periods, and also different scholarly attitudes. So I see them as complementary, but I'm personally more interested in the period of conquest itself, and there has been a lot of work across Europe and also other areas of the ancient world on studying this archaeologically. I'm showing here very briefly just a site of a massacre in southern Spain, Cerro de la Cruz, where Fernando Quesada and his team has uncovered ample evidence of a massacre where bodies show signs of torture and amputations, and this was probably a retaliation in the context of a campaign around the middle of the 2nd century BC, probably Lusitanian Wars. The Romans were retaliating against a community, probably taking part of the people enslaved and killing others as an example, including examples of mutilations. When it comes to the Gallic Wars, a topic that I have been working on together, particularly together with my colleague Nico Roymans from Amsterdam, there's ample evidence by Caesar himself about this, and also other writers. For example, Appian and Plutarch claimed that Julius Caesar killed 1 million and enslaved another 1 million of his Gallic opponents. And there has been a lot of discussion to what extent these are exaggerations. Obviously not exact figures, but even if we will take only half or a third of this, it would still have been a huge percentage of the population that lived there at the time. And if any of you is interested, Nico and I have a paper in a volume edited by Rubina on this, on the archaeology of Julius Caesar. Looking at, I'm just giving some very selected examples to go quickly through this. There are obviously many others. There's a site in Belgium called Thuin, which is a late Iron Age oppidum. And Nico Roymans has identified this as the oppidum of the Tuki conquered in 57 BC, where the entire population would have been, more than 50,000 people, would have then been sold as slaves. And this could be a potential case of ethnocide, where the community is not physically killed, but being deported as slaves, they are breaking the links between them, they're destroying them as a group. There are several arguments for the identification of these sites with the place mentioned by Caesar, the fact there's a late Iron Age fortification, the biggest in the area that did not survive into Roman times, the location in the territory attributed to the Tuki. The topography matches very well with Caesar's description, which is actually something very common. Caesar might have distorted many things, but in terms of topographic description, he seemed to be accurate. There are gold horns that provide a chronology into this period, and also concentrations of Roman lead sling bullets, which is something that we encounter at many of the places attacked by the Roman army. Another place a bit further north in the southern Netherlands, Kessel-Lid, has been identified as the possible place of the massacre of the Tenteri and Usipetes. This is something described by Caesar that in the winter of 56-55 BC, the two tribes crossed the lower Rhine. They sent messengers to Caesar saying they didn't want any trouble with Rome, they just were looking for a place to settle. The request was rejected. The Germans had gathered all the possessions and the community and an encampment, and Caesar gave instructions to his army to attack them and kill as many as possible, including women and children. And then many of these would have died, killed by the Roman army when they were trying to escape. And at Kessel-Lid, for a long time, people have been encountering human remains and also weaponry and so on. Interpretations have shifted over time, but nowadays, I think this link with the massacre in 55 BC seems quite plausible. Again, Roymans has published this. Similarities with topography, radiocarbon dates, which obviously are not completely precise, but give you are compatible with this. Salts from the same workshop, and particularly a large number of human skeletal remains, including bones of women and children with traces of ancient injuries. And we are speaking here probably of tens of thousands of people that would have died at this event. In the case of the Burones, I already mentioned this. Caesar's claimed that the race and the name of that people may be annihilated, maybe a case of a genocide, since there's a very clear intention that is expressed. And in terms of the demographic impact in the areas of the Burones and neighboring regions, Roymans and other colleagues have been doing very interesting research looking at settlement patterns. It's not only about massacres and battle sites, it's also looking just what happens with settlements over time. Do we see continuity or do we see significant discontinuity? And there are several regions where we have discontinuity ranging from nearly total discontinuity to partial. And what's also very interesting is that in some cases it takes several decades to recover, even several generations until the demography in these regions recovers. I just want to give very briefly some glimpses into some other areas where I have been doing some work. One are the Cantabrian and Asturian Wars in northern Spain. These were the last free populations of the Iberian Peninsula that were incorporated by Emperor Augustus. 10 years of war and 8 legions were needed to subdue the region, and between 29 and 19 BC. Obviously, these wars would have had an important political component. We're just after the end of the Roman civil wars. And the official Roman narrative is that the Asturians and Cantabria were doing raids against other populations that were already under Roman control. I'm not denying that some raids might have taken place, but I think we need to look beyond, in this case and in many others, beyond official discourses, beyond justifications by imperial powers, and looking at other motives, gain of prestige for Augustus, finding an external enemy after a long period of civil wars, and also very crucially important mineral resources of the region, and perhaps also control of the harbors for the future campaigns in Germania. According to Cassius Dio, the land of the Cantabria was devastated. For a long time, there was basically no archaeological evidence for this, which led some people, both ancient historians and archaeologists, to underestimate actually the effects of the conquest and question what the written sources were saying. But in the last decade, this has changed significantly since the 1990s. Different research teams have discovered around 60 Roman marching camps, episodes of hill for destruction, even spectacular battle events, for example, on Monte Bernori and La Loma, in the case of La Loma, where colleagues like Peralta and others have been excavating. More than 3,000 Roman arrowheads have been discovered so far, an entire siege system. So one of the largest collections of Roman militaria, also many other objects found there. In the case of Monte Bernori, where I worked for some years with colleagues, we have a massive Roman attack in 26 or 25 BC against the largest oppidum of the Canterbury. We have a large Roman military camp of 40 hectares in front of the oppidum, and then we have evidence of destruction, burnt layers, Roman military finds, and so on. And then settlement at the site stops, and it's never resettled again, with the exception of a Roman castellum placed on the top of the site. So this is a site that has a very long settlement history, going back to the Bronze Age, that stops with a massive Roman attack. And just with finishing with the examples, I want to bring one from Scotland, the site of Burnsworth here in southwest Scotland. It's a very interesting place, again, and a very important indigenous hill fort. And in the 2nd century AD, we have 2 Roman military camps and numerous Roman projectiles at the site. The evidence has been debated for a long time, with interpretation ranging from a massive Roman attack to a Roman training camp at a place that was already abandoned when the Romans arrived. New research carried out by John Reed and Andrew Nicholson and others have uncovered, I think, very substantial evidence that, in my opinion, proves that this was a massive Roman attack taking place probably in the context of the Antonine reinvasion of Scotland. We have around 700 confirmed Roman sling bullets, like the one you can see here, but many more are still in the ground. So this might have been an act of exemplary violence designed as a warning to anyone who resisted Roman rule. And here you can see some of the sling bullets. They did metal detector service and then some small targeted excavation trenches. And very recently, we published a paper in the Journal of Conflict Archaeology that came out just recently, where we applied COCO analysis. I'm not going to go into details, but this is a terrain analysis system used by the US Army that has also applied to battlefield studies, both of the modern period and also of the ancient world. And putting this analysis together with the results from the surveys and the excavations, the evidence strongly suggests that this we have here is an active siege ending in a storming assault. And here, a recreation made by the colleagues from the Tremontian Trust in Scotland for the public as part of the virtual reality experience, showing the scale of the massive Roman attack on the indigenous hill fort. But violence, of course, doesn't stop just with the conquest itself. We also have to consider that the violence is not only a physical phenomenon, but include other dimensions like structural, cultural violence. It doesn't end with the conquest, but extends to many other areas of life in the post-conquest period, which can range from dispossessing people from the land to make room for colonial settlers, to a wide range of changes in different spheres. We have iconography as symbolic violence, for example. It was a celebration of victories over foreign barbarians, both in the city of Rome itself, but also in the conquered territories, like this Richesnet distance slab from Scotland. And Daniel obviously has also published things in this kind of line of argumentation. He introduced this concept of epistemicide that I found very interesting, showing that imperial violence is not only reflecting the destruction of human life, but also in the obliteration of other forms of knowledge, basing himself on the work of decolonial scholars such as de Sousa Santons. In that sense, he has argued that Roman expansionism would have resulted in a loss of epistemic diversity reflected along multiple vectors, from mass enslavement to ecological upheaval. And in relation to the ecological impact, I want to mention just one among many examples, which are the mines of Las Médulas in northwest Spain, which are an impressive landscape. But what we see here is not the natural landscape. The landscape has been profoundly shaped and destroyed by the mining activities. This became the most important gold mines in the Roman Empire, and actually the Cantabrian and Asturian wars had a lot to do with this exploitation of these mineral resources. And here we have this kind of this contrast between, on the one side, an incredible achievement in terms of engineering techniques and economic exploitation, but also massive destruction of the environment. And in fact, ice core data from Greenland indicate, well, more widely, that there's a significant surge in mineral air pollution in Spain during the Roman period, and that the generated level of atmospheric lead were not reached again until the Industrial Revolution. So I want to finish just with a few final reflections. As my colleague John Reed said recently in his book on the history of Roman Scotland, Roman cruelty was, in its individual horrors, no more extreme than any other culture of its time, but it was more systematized and persistent, and was orchestrated on an unimaginable scale. This kind of predatory practices obviously don't start with Rome. They have a much wider tradition. If you look at the Near East, you find many things that are quite horrible as well, and obviously also in other areas of the world. We have massacre deposits in Europe since the Neolithic, but the scale obviously changes, and scale matters. So I want to just to finish just by reclaiming another history. History, as has often been said, is written by the victors, but with visions of traditionally privileged, the wealthy, the successful, to the detriment to the defeated, the oppressed, and the marginalized. And in our current world that is unfortunately still marked by war, displacement, strong inequalities, I think giving voice to the victims, to the oppressed, is not only a research necessity, but also a moral obligation. And then we need to communicate to this uncomfortable past to the public. Here's an example from an interpretation center in Southeast Spain, a site Iliturgi, an indigenous oppidum that was destroyed completely by the Romans as a retaliation in the context of this Second Punic War. And the colleagues have tried to bring this side of the past to the public, which is actually not that easy. But what they have done here is a very different narrative than what you encounter at most sites. You have an old woman telling in a video, telling the story of their people, and so, which is not completely uncontroversial because sometimes visitors don't expect that when you bring school groups or so. But it's important that we try to find ways to communicate to some comfortable past. So when we're speaking about reimagining ancient worlds, and we have seen many different amazing presentations from different angles here, we are creating new stories, we need to create new stories, and these stories need to include also the oppressed. So I'm not advocating that our narratives should only focus on these darker sides. Obviously, collaboration, hybridization, diplomacy, negotiation were integral parts of life. But the more negative aspects also need to be integrated in our accounts. We cannot explain the splendor of the city of Rome, which is monumental architecture and artworks, without acknowledging that it was to a large extent the result of a predatory model based on the spoils of war and the exploitation of the defeated. This is not about demonizing any ancient cultures. It's about creating more inclusive accounts and also develop empathy with the fate of those less fortunate in the past and the present. And in this sense, I want to quote here the subtitle of this book by Tom Devine. What I'm advocating for is that we write histories of the dispossessed. And I want to finish with this image created by the colleagues from Jaén of the refugees from the Battle of Baecula from the Second Punic War, which tries to bring this other past to the forefront, showing also the people who suffer often the most in this kind of conflicts, women, children, elderly, and so, which are often not so represented in mainstream narratives, but we need to reclaim their memory, reclaim their history, and also in that sense, rethink our current world and the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Can I invite questions or comments? Anyone? Lara.
Hey, thank you so much for that. So I wanted to ask you about a set of vocabulary that you didn't use in this talk, but that you've used in your past scholarship, and just like how that's working with this, which is the internal and external thing. Because one of the things that strikes me about your first examples, about your Iron Age examples, is that you also brought in a third part to this, right? You said there's like an increased energy, there's an increased economic prerogative to do the slaving. Therefore, some people are going to a third place. So there's a pull factor from group one that is causing group two to go someplace else and predate on group three. Which is structurally a kind of different model than a lot of the stuff from the Roman period. And how are you thinking about those various types of predation? And like, is it different when we have those more complicated structures that have pull factors versus, or I'd be interested in hearing your sort of expansion thought on that.
Yes, no, you make a very good point. Yeah, there's some difference, but also similarities. First, with the early Iron Age example, I think what is interesting, and that's the area I'm less familiar with, because I haven't done much direct work on that yet, but is that we see these regional differences, areas that were already some of these elements that people have scored, like Scythian type or so, it's already present, and it seems communities are adopting it, they're part of embedded in it. Those areas are actually not affected by this rage, but this destruction. It's other sorts of groups that are actually targeted. So there seems to be a very clear distinction. It's not just we take slaves wherever we can. We target certain areas on the periphery for enslaving. In that sense, it can also show some similarities what we observe with the Roman case in the late Republic, when before the Roman conquest, we know there is slave trade on a quite substantial scale, probably coming from Gaul into the Roman world. So some groups, what we call indigenous, but that's just an umbrella term for very diverse groups. But some of these groups are raiding other groups. We have very little information about how that actually took place. But this will have happened in Gaul, will have happened also in Iron Age, late Iron Age Britain. So we have some groups targeting other groups. So in a way, the dynamics, I think, could be roughly similar, obviously, with all the differences of scale and culture, and so that you can take into account. But yeah. And obviously also emphasizing always the diversity of this. In terms of simplifying, we speak about these different groups. There's a lot of complexity on all of the various sides.
Is there any, thank you for a wonderful talk. Depressing, but wonderful. Is there any connection between the development of coinage and the increase in the slave trade or the capture of?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, it's not the only motivation, but it plays a role. But it's not necessarily the invention of coinage in an initial stage. It's the monetization on a larger scale where actually coinage spreads to much wider segment society, transactions, and so on. So it's different in scale that we see in the Black Sea region, but we also see it in temperate Europe later when coinage is adopted. So initial coinage doesn't have that impact. It's the latest expansion that where it seems that it plays a certain role, and also this kind of humans as commodities that you exchange, and so. So coinage plays a role, but it's only part of the story, and and it's not a necessity, but sometimes it can contribute to this picture. And when it comes to temperate Europe, coinage has been often interpreted as the initial introduction related to, well, it's a bit of a different phenomenon, but with mercenaries from temperate Europe serving in Mediterranean armies, bringing back coinage. And in fact, some of the earliest coins that are minted locally seem to be reusing metal from coinage from the south. But that, in turn, this kind of things over time also changed local realities. So there's always this interconnection of factors.
Thank you, Manuel. That description of wonderful but depressing was very accurate. My question is about the term predatory economy, which I think is really interesting. But is there a risk that it obscures what it is that we need to explain, in a sense? Is that we then explain these actions because this is a predatory economy, and it becomes a typology that in itself is a kind of explanatory. You therefore don't need to go beyond that and explain what is driving that, what's producing it. And we've become, in the way that many terms in archaeology have become kind of, all you need to do is evoke it and you've got your explanation, whereas actually that is the thing we need to explain in itself. So is there perhaps a risk there in using that term?
There is, and you make a very fair point, but I think that applies to basically all terms or concepts that we use. Obviously, I just see concepts as tools, and what we obviously, as you rightly say, what we need to look is beyond that, look at the mechanisms that are beyond that and all the interrelated factors. So I take your point. Having said this, I do think it has some validity to explain certain types of phenomena. And coming back to one of the things that I mentioned before, I think it's important to recognize that this violence is not only externalized, but also internal. Because if you look at the first century BC, for example, Rome, you have most of the century are civil wars. So you have a society that has built very competitive mechanisms that lead to the use of violence between different factions in a very fluid, very dynamic way. But the violence is also internalized and externalized on a massive scale. And that's where I think this kind of predation comes in. Obviously, material culture playing a key role in that, enabling different forms of warfare, enabling different sorts of economies that require this kind of exploitation, both of humans and non-humans, as well as we see, for example, exploitation of mineral resources, grain, and all of these kind of things.
Manuel, thank you very much for it was the terrible slot, but you won it. Thank you. So come to the final paper of the afternoon of the conference. It's a great pleasure to introduce Rubina Raya, who is Professor of Classical Archaeology and Art at Aarhus University in Denmark, specialising in the archaeology and art of the Greek East and wider Eastern Mediterranean, particularly focused on city societies, self-representational aspects of the Greek East between 300 BC and late antiquity. Many of us will know Rubina as the very dynamic creator and director of UrbNet, the National Research Foundation of Denmark's Centre of Excellence, and generating books, journals, and very large numbers of dynamic younger scholars, and also as an excavator at Jerash and as an expert on the art of Palmyra. Her books include Pearl of the Desert, A History of Palmyra, 2022, Urban Development and Regional Identity in the Eastern Roman Provinces, 2012, Palmyrian Sarcophagi, 2023. So you'll see what I meant about being prolific. Rubina, we're looking forward very much to hearing your talk. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and let me join every other speaker in thanking the team, thanking John for the invitation, also the other speakers, the discussants, and particularly thank you to John for putting me last in the program. That's always a pleasure, with on the one hand the pressure to make sure we finish on time, and then the freedom of perhaps just going on and making you all very, very tired. So let's see where this ends. But my presentation will present a very small insight into how century-long ways of structuring, harnessing, owning and appropriating knowledge, in fact, still are in place today, not least because we as scholars often do not engage with the historiography of our disciplines or with the historiography of research of the regions or sites that we work on. And while that statement rather is an observation than necessarily a critique, it's also an invitation to us all to take on the responsibility to bring archaeology and historiography of research into much closer dialogue in the future. And also to face even more openly the entanglements between doing archaeology and shaping, making, writing, or inventing history. And I think that resonates hopefully very well with what we've seen in the papers over the last 2 days, and also the panel discussion yesterday. And perhaps I'd like to draw to the forefront in particular what was said yesterday about the parameters of loss, and also our responsibility of sharing and communicating, but also how our specializations, as also was brought up yesterday, can lead to isolation and a non-interest in what other people are doing. So I hope that some of what I'm going to say now can resonate with that. We've all been asked to expose the plurality of ancient stories to tell, in particular, with a focus on bringing to the forefront stories which do not match the focus on imperial power structures that we normally, and perhaps also still surprisingly, tend to focus on. The well-known tropes of how the ancient world often still is researched, perceived, and communicated. And I was asked by John to speak on ancient urbanism and alternative narratives. But how do we expose alternative narratives through built environments, which tend to get in our way and block our views quite literally with their monumentality, large monuments, and push us naturally towards narratives about imperialism and its success? In my view, an entirely different approach is needed, namely connecting ancient urbanism much closer to the historiography of research and excavations and the staging of ancient urbanism in earlier scholarship. Why this is, but still not is done at large, I aim to draw some conclusions about through a focus on one city exclusively, which is considered iconic still today, and its archaeological exploration in the early 20th century, namely the Decapolis city Gerasa, Antioch on the Gold River, located in modern northern Jordan. I'll take you back in time about a century to a period and a region which have been pivotal to the emergence of the ways we still think about ancient cities, namely that of the inter-World War period in the Middle East. I draw my examples from my own archaeological and archival research at and on the site, and also from published and unpublished materials by scholars who were influential advocates of a trend, namely that of an emerging urban archaeology, but whose work until today has not been disentangled from or even within the power structures of academic discourses. And I pull to the forefront some overlooked examples relating to the opinions of Mikhail Ivanovich Rostovtsev on urbanism. And I use the early 20th century excavations in Gerasa as one example of the ways in which the understanding of the urban was shaped in a mold of European, Western, and anti-Western tendencies in this inter-World War period, often to the detriment of what in fact was coming out of the ground. And so in turn, I hope to provoke some thoughts on what might also be termed the construction of modernity on the monumental ruins of the ancient past. Life and city are identical. Life in the country is not life. If you take the Roman Empire and the Hellenistic monarchies and even the Greek world from the point of view of political, social, and economic life, you will see there is an agglomeration of cities. And that was not me who said that, but Rostovtsev, who said that in unpublished lectures from 1922. The citation comes from these lectures on urban land economics. And I'll quote a bit more to set the scene, but I didn't dare to type it out. Rostovtsev began his lectures in this way. I quote, "I do not know whether or not my course will be on land economics, but it'll certainly be on economic and social conditions, that is sure. Now, what is my purpose in giving this short introduction to your work? It is to interpret one of the main problems of economic and social life. And I do not know if you, being Americans, grasp entirely the importance of this problem. But I, being a Russian, grasp it fully and entirely. Now you will ask why, and I will tell you. The problem I mean is the problem produced by the existence in our social life of two different types of men, the country people and the city people. Of course, these two types exist also in this country, and there he means America, but as far as I know, there's no such sharp antagonism, so sharp a contrast between these two types as there is, for example, in Russia, or to a lesser extent in Western Europe. He goes on, now if you look at our civilization as our civilization was formed, you must say that it is a city civilization. It was formed in and by city people. Everything which was new in our civilization was first started in the city and gradually and very slowly spread to the country parts of the land. And then he says, but life in the country is not life. Life and city are identical. Now the cities naturally rule, dictate the country, and the country usually obeys orders. If they do not, Russian conditions come out, revolt and war. So keep that in mind. 1922. Rostovtsev gave his lectures only 1 year after the German sociologist Max Weber published his Die Stadt, a piece of work which many scholars in the urban still are influenced by. Weber's bundle criteria for what constitutes a city resonates very strongly even today in scholarship on ancient urbanism. Archaeologists and historians like to count monuments and tick boxes, which in turn for them make up a city, while often not engaging with what gets lost between categorization, filling out lists, and looking for the same monuments which we've been excavating for many centuries. Another theater, another bath complex, another temple seem much more exciting to many, and perhaps most importantly also to the funders. So if there are funders in the room, then please sponsor the invisible and alternative stories, the often very ugly archaeology of real life. And I just give you one short example here of a little amulet found in our excavation, published many years ago in Nature, which in fact turned out to be the until now only existing amulet in Pseudo-Arabic with an opening line of Greek characters from 8th century Gerraj. So the small, ugly archaeology that changes really our knowledge about the world. Over the following years, so post-1922, Rostovtsev developed his thoughts on cities and their functions in the ancient world. And he was one of the primus motors in the push for large-scale excavations in the Near East, also those at Gerasa, driven to a large extent by his own ideologies and ideas about the trajectories between the West, Europe and America, and Russia, and the trajectories between the city and countryside. And about Gerasa, he said what you see quoted on the slide, and went on to say, there is nothing in the history of Gerasa to attract the special attention of the historians of the ancient world. With the institutionalization of the British and French mandates in the region that occurred in the wake of the dissolution of the 4 centuries-long Ottoman Empire, the number of archaeological expeditions led by Westerners in the region grew rapidly. Archaeological fieldwork became one of the prolonged arms of the colonial and imperialistic states, now in charge of large parts of the region, and with the power to grant archaeological concessions to excavate the sites judged important, and judged important by whom. Many of these sites were already known, but in most cases famously such as Gerasa and Palmyra, they had not been systematically explored archaeologically, but had rather been places from where artworks had made their way through looting and collecting into European, Russian, and later American collections, collections which to this day stand as testaments to the dispersal and dissolution of these places and their heritage. And I just show you here a slide from my Palmyra portrait project that shows a mapping of all the collections that hold Palmyrene portraits across the world, more than 230 of those, and a list of the largest collections. Of course, we don't quite know how the situation looks in Syria. So at this point, foreign missions poured into the region and occupied sites and the towns that surrounded these sites, and the local cultural heritage poured out of the region. The foreign missions had expedition houses constructed, employed and fired the local population as workers, imported skilled labor from many other countries, had land expropriated or bought it if needed, compensated sometimes locals for lost crops, and surveyed the local population's private houses for ancient materials. As a result, the local economies at these modern sites were profoundly changed, and global politics were brought directly into the day-to-day lives of the local populations, who in turn rearranged their internal power structures accordingly. Research has increasingly focused on such narratives of local experiences, including the impact that foreign missions had on the local societies. However, there are surprisingly few surviving records which tell us about day-to-day life during archaeological fieldwork and the experiences of locals. Gerasa, a middle-sized city, mainly, or not mainly, but flourishing also in the 2nd century CE, and the excavations conducted there in the 1920s and 30s can be seen within that framework as well. The archaeological mission produced some of the most important results of Roman urbanism, but the excavations directors were selective about what they published from their excavations. Their focus was on the Roman and Christian pasts, and to a much lesser degree on the pre-Roman and post-late antique periods. And here you see a quotation from Lindsay from an earlier period, from the early 19th century, where he ends his not very nice description of Gerasa with calling it a very fair specimen of a second-rate provincial Roman town. And that's why I have been studying for decades, for example. Rostovtsev was a primus motor in these excavations, although we don't know very much about it. He had strong opinions on what should be excavated and why, and in 1931 he visited Gerasa for 2 days to walk over the excavations and ruins, discussing the possibilities also of future work. The Gerasa excavation archive, which did not begin its life as an archive, but as mere excavation documentation, has since the mid-1930s been at Yale University. The documents give unique glimpses into the work undertaken and the decisions made during the excavation. However, until recently, this material has never been studied to extract information about the parts of the excavations that were in fact never published, or for insights into the interaction between the Western team, the Egyptian foreman, the skilled workers, the local workforce, the visitors to the excavation, the Transjordanian government, the Antiquity Service, as well as the hitherto unpublished parts of the excavation. And importantly, also about the way in which the idea of the ideal ancient city was constructed, also during the excavations by the scholars working there. The Gerasa material is presented uncontextualized from its origins in the archive storage facilities at Yale, in the incomplete database, in the galleries of Yale University Art Gallery and on ArtStore, and can exclusively be recontextualized by individuals who have a deep first-hand knowledge of the site, its excavation history and topography, and that's arguably not very many people in the world. Such archival haphazardness raises questions about potential new ways of thinking more constructively about digitalization strategies and contextualized accessibility. But until recently, this archival material, or parts of it, was exclusively referred to in passing by scholars who had conducted fieldwork at Gerasa and therefore had been interested in selected parts of the archive's content. But a recent initiated project at Aarhus University is currently changing that situation by addressing the documentation in a contextualized manner and making it available to a broader audience. The history of Gerasa and its archaeological exploration has been addressed in other places, and I will not summarize it here, but just say that it was the German Jasper Ulrich Seetzen who put Gerasa back on the map in the correct place, but there's also an until recently unknown massive German excavation campaign in 1902 going on there, where the team from Baalbek went one summer to Gerasa to excavate and among other things produced beautiful drawings, reconstruction drawings. Here is a profile drawing of the Artemision, and you also see that they reconstructed classical sculptural groups, here recontextualizing the non-existing Laocoon in Gerasa into one of the large niches of the sanctuary. So these drawings are also under publications, and maybe these are more an expression of sunstroke than anything else, but at least the Germans did not consider Gerasa important enough to stay there, so they went back to Baalbek. But the Brits and the Americans were later in contact with them about their findings. But what a study of the archival material brings to the forefront is twofold. While it's clear that the material is not complete, it's not clear whether it's now less complete than when it arrived at Yale. And furthermore, it's also clear that the material holds important facts about the archaeology of Gerasa, as well as about the life during the campaigns undertaken at the site. It's also clear that the archival materials consist of a string of excavation documentation from the various campaigns, but that significant amounts of material are missing, perhaps never was handed over to the institution, including diaries from several campaigns, drawn documentation of parts of the excavation, and some photographic material. The material were turned into an archive, and that archive in itself has become a statement of fragmented urban and anti-urban structures. The Hellenistic period in the Near East is one which is still heavily debated. How urbanized was the region? What does that mean? Where's the evidence? It's the classic Fergus Miller versus Maurice Sartre narratives about what happened in the pre-Roman period in this region. And so I was very excited when I discovered unpublished documents also on the Hellenistic remains from the excavations on the so-called Camp Hill, which were not published in the 1938 volume by Kreling. And the question then also arose, of course, about why this material had not been published. And one reason seems simply to have been the difficult and unpretty nature of the Hellenistic remains, the non-monumental stuff. The campaign in 1931 began 30th of March with the arrival of Clarence Fisher to the site with some other team members, and the next day he writes that the real work began with the visit by Rostovtsev, who spent the afternoon of the 31st of March walking around the site and discussing the possibilities of future work. It's clear that Rostovtsev was one of the masterminds behind the excavations in Gerasa and the direction they were to take over the years, despite the fact that he spent very little time there. The site was his first, or one of his first urban struggles, his emerging formulation of the narrative about the European and the non-European, about the urban versus the anti-urban. The construction of the expedition camp on Camp Hill, where the Hellenistic architectural remains were found, had already begun in 1928. However, the constructions had not been finished during the campaigns between 28 and 31, so there was still a focus on enlarging this camp area through the construction of stone houses, houses that were in fact constructed from the ancient remains that were being excavated. That's also clearly explained in the diaries, and which in turn might also have been another reason that the excavations in the end were not published. Throughout his fieldwork diary from 1931, Fischer mentions people, team members, visitors, the workforce, as well as the Egyptian foreman, and also highly skilled academics who came with the team to Jerash and worked at several other excavations in the regions. But we do not get much of an insight into the lives of the local Arabs, Bedouins, and Circassians. These groups are mentioned as working on the excavations, and numerous appear in the photographs. There are many more photographs of the working force than there actually are of the team members. And they are never mentioned by name. But we do learn a lot about the local politics as well. We learn, among other things, that Bedouin tribes met in the hippodrome of Gerasa to settle border disputes and used the ancient monuments as monuments of power, sort of sketching out their own contemporary lives, using these monumental structures to sort of underline the tribal powers. We learn a bit about the treatment that they received from Fischer and his colleagues, including the harsh treatment after some workmen had chipped off moldings of pedestals to be used in the building of the camp. And I quote here, "Horsfeld came in to complain about the breakage of some pedestals near the house. We've been collecting the stones for the camp building, and it seems that some of the workmen chipped off moldings of pedestals which lay partly exposed. We had already made an inquiry and had dismissed 2 workmen suspecting doing the damage. As we are not sure that they are the real culprits, we will simply dismiss 2 additional men who have been working around the house every day until someone tells. It's the only way of getting at the truth, as the people need the employment and will do anything to keep their jobs." In other places, Fischer describes the number of workmen employed ranging from 80 to 120, depending on the time of the campaign. He also describes that land must be leased or bought in a variety of circumstances, and people must be paid to give up their land on which crop otherwise could have grown. He also describes that how leaving part of an excavation open in turn gives the land the status of antiquities and can therefore be expropriated without paying for it. In turn, he gives good insight into how the excavations fragmented a very dynamic ancient urban landscape, which among other things was used for modern farming. Many names of visitors are given in the documents, and it does not take much to deduce that these were prominent figures who were traveling and exploring around the region, usually with a base in Jerusalem. These academic and intellectual networks were very tightly knit, also over generations. And you see here the seating plan from Harald Ingholt's retirement dinner at Yale University, and if you know a little bit about excavation history, you will see how ideas must have been flowing over more than 60 years among these people who decided what got to be published and what not. These academic and intellectual networks were very tightly knit. Europeans and Americans exiled Easterners like Rostovtsev, and to a growing degree Jewish scholars, intermingled through the various fieldwork projects. Egyptian foremen worked across many excavations, and people like Hogglesby, for example, who measured out Gerasa, and Labib, who drew the map of it for the American team, also worked on a string of other projects. The Coptic Christian Labib Sorial, belonging to the Egyptian Effendi class, worked on the team. And in Fisher's diary, it's clear that Labib was the one who drew the first and very famous, also today, urban map of Gerasa, the map which in Rostovtsev's 1932 Caravan Cities was credited to Fisher only, without any mention of Labib. Labib's map is just one example of the appropriation of the work of others by Fisher, others, and Rostovtsev in his race to write the urban history of the site before anyone else, and in turn that of the trajectories between the Western and Russian worlds and their socio-economic trajectories, which really is at the heart of what he wanted to write about. So delving into the archives of the excavations of Gerasa in the 1920s and 30s certainly give food for thought on fragmented urban anti-structures and structures on a variety of levels, spanning from approaches to the universal meaning of ancient urbanism to actual on-the-ground excavation strategies, structural frameworks, and ways of thinking, which were spurred on by the grand thoughts of a prominent Russian, as well as his circle of academic colleagues, American, British, and other European scholars, who to various degrees came to be inspired and guided by his thought. The fieldwork diary of Clarence Fisher was his working document. He used his diary to check facts and evidence and the progression of the excavations. However, he did so with the excavation documentation at hand, which in relation to Camp Hill excavations are missing today. Whether this documentation was already missing at the time Kreling wrote and edited the later 1938 publication is difficult to ascertain. However, it's noticeable that Kreling says that those excavations were only undertaken on Camp Hill in order not to lose archaeological evidence when constructing the expedition camp, but then goes on to say that they won't be published in the 1938 volume. Fisher's diary truly is invaluable today. Through it, we not only learn important facts about the Camp Hill excavations and the ugly unpublished parts of archaeology, may be disappointing to the 1920s and 30s team, although it was Hellenistic. But we also learn much about the workings of the campaign, its employees, the local economy, the relationship between the local antiquity services and that of the mandate powers. And most importantly, to the context of this presentation about the wide circulations of emerging ideologies about ancient urbanism and what urbanism should prove to the world, in this case, according to Rostovtsev. And I quote here from Kreling. Gerasa is, of course, only one of the thousands of cities of the Roman Empire. Among these centers of ancient life, it ranks comparatively low, a provincial city and one that is today only imperfectly known. And yet it has its importance. In its exceptionally well-preserved buildings, it reflects the splendor of what we call Roman art and civilization and shows how many and various were the aspects which this Roman civilization and art had. The aspect with which Gerasa shows is one which enables us not only to better understand the provincial life of the Roman Empire, but to see beyond it into the future, into the coming of new civilizations, which are still alive in the Orient. And that's from Rostovtsev's preface in the Kreling volume. So I end my presentation with this quotation, which in turn points back to my opening and hopefully underlines my argument about the excavations of Gerasa being just one example of the ways in which the understanding of the urban was shaped in a mold of European Western and also anti-Western tendencies in this crucial inter-World War period. And that these excavations often were undertaken to the detriment of what was in fact coming out of the ground. I hope to have spurred some thought about the way in which we sometimes knowingly and very often unknowingly have constructed modernity on the ruins of the ancient pasts, on fragments of urban structures, ignoring the fragments of the anti-urban structures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rubina. Fascinating paper. Can I invite comments and questions from the floor?
Thank you, Rubina. So you sort of touched on something right at the end, which also came out in the one small find that you pulled out that is sort of non-urban in the sense that it's a small handheld object. And that has to do with how Roman something like this is. And we're all used to this point to questioning and moving away from thinking of places like Palmyra or Baalbek or Garasha as being Roman cities. So I guess in looking to, I'm sorry, I'm getting this a little bit mixed up, but as you were finishing, I was also thinking about something that Manuel said, which is, we tend to think of conquest, we tend to think of one side of a narrative. And you showed this rotating image from your project of the city. And we see the big monuments, right, that are astounding, the amphitheater or the round form. So how do you see us looking past this to the small things or to the things that help us unsee these monuments that, as you so evocatively said, sort of get in the way of being able to see what else is there?
Well, I think one way of doing that in a very basic way is just going to excavate in the non-monumental areas. That's of course what, if I had given that talk, that's what we've done in the project that I've been heading there in the Northwest Quarter, where there's not a single stone on top of another stone, because it turned out that it was all earthquake destroyed. But so go to the urban periphery or the places where you think you will definitely not find a monument, but usually you will anyhow, but different kinds of monuments than the ones that we usually have our narratives about. But as I also started out with, that's of course a matter of, on the one hand, funding, but also a matter of understanding the archaeological history of a site before even thinking about sticking the spade in the ground. Not to talk about well, the ethical implications of working in these places where usually also looting goes on, even though they are protected archaeological sites. So the moment you open something up, you also have the responsibility to finish it and preserve it, but that doesn't even necessarily protect it for the future, if that makes sense as well. So I think that's one way. And then, of course, the archives are another way to at least get to some of that information and unlock it in a hopefully meaningful way. But that's even more difficult to get funding for.
Brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it. Not really. I don't really have a question. I wanted to just add a comment, an anecdote about the funding, and how important is that we also try to change attitudes about what is recognized as important. One of the sites I showed, Monte Bernorio, was this Roman attack, and so my colleague working there, Quechu Torres, he worked there for many years uncovering this massive battlefield, life on a site over 1,000 years, always very little money, a lot of effort. But then one year he excavated at another site, Roman site, and he found a mosaic just a few kilometers away. And then he got a prize, he got an award, he was in all the newspapers. And I mean, great, and he really deserved it. But I mean, the prize came for the Roman mosaic, not for all the other work, which from a historical perspective, obviously has wider significance. And I mean, there are countless cases about this. We can also look at more recent examples. I was visiting a slave plantation in Arkansas a few years ago. You have the plantation, everything is presented, then, but you see the materiality there. But where were the houses of the slaves? No? Well, we believe they are somewhere over there, but there's nothing left that people, okay, there's some acknowledgement that was there, but yeah, it's a mixture of attitudes about what to research, what to fund, and also obviously the materiality of the remains, that in many cases, many things will leave less traces, but we need to put more effort, and I think you're doing a brilliant work in uncovering this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am really curious to hear both about how about the pitch to funders, you know, and we can talk more about that because it is really difficult as I've run around, you know, trying to find because ACLS is a regranter, funding from major foundations that don't fall in the trap that you've both just described, the mosaic winning the wrong mosaic winning the prize, et cetera. The other question, though, I had, so I'd love more thoughts about like the positive pitch that you do tell, because I have had trouble, I'm continuing my first thought. I've had trouble talking about loss or silence or erasures, like that doesn't land well, even if it's true in a sense. So I'm always trying to find kind of affirmative or positive stories or that to tell to fund work like this. My other question had to do with the really interesting slide you showed of the, and I'm not an archaeologist, so this is very new, this is not my area at all, but the slide you showed showing the dispersal of objects around different museums, and it reminded me of the conversation we had last night about collaboration, and I'm wondering what kinds of what that fact of dispersion does to your analysis, and what kinds of resources. I mean, how much it matters. Again, I'm asking this not familiar with method, and how much it matters whether. How it affects the kinds of work you can do, and whether new aggregations of material digitally as well as physically might advance work. And I'm also just very curious about the history of how it got dispersed, but more interested in what the fact of dispersion does, the challenges and opportunities to research, to collaborative research.
Go back to that. Slide.
Yeah, that was it.
So this slide comes from my more than decade-long Palmyra portrait project, which I've undertaken with a set of postdocs, PhDs, who've been writing monographs with me, loads of articles, edited volumes, those sorts of things. It was a project where I wrote the application in the fall of 2011. I got the funding from the Carlsberg Foundation on the 1st of December 2011. I could start the project in 2012. It was a 3-year funding application because I was massively wrong. I had said, I think there is around 1,500 Palmyrene portraits surviving in the world. And today we have 3,975. And then I was very lucky that the Carlsberg Foundation, which is a Danish foundation, understands that people, even professors, can get it wrong. And they have funded the project for now 12 years. It is now coming to an end, but it's coming to an end, through all these collaborative publications we've done over the 10 years and a 10-volume corpus with these 4,000 portraits in them. And in that process of wanting to do something that was but deeply art historical and classical archaeological, of course, we had to disentangle object biographies, history of research. Who brought these things to Australia? Who brought them to Russia, and why? And it was this rush of getting it before other people got it, and all these. So there was a large political and even military component of dispersing Palmyrene antiquities in the 19th and early 20th century. So again, that takes a lot of understanding from the side of the funders to understand that these sorts of things give you a map of something completely different. And I hope that that's a little bit what I hope to have shown, that that's what we intend to do with the Gaza archives as well. This multi-layered narratives of what it is that, in principle, one piece of sculpture, one piece of architecture can tell us if we put the right documentation together. And I think a recent insight for me is at least, going around to all these collections and really realizing that they are just a manifest of the dispersal of places. So sort of trying to bring those places together through that dispersal that we can now do, at least in a visual way, I think that has some meaning for heritage and the way we do collection histories and those sorts of things.
Would you use the term predatory economy?
So I would use, I mean, they even use it themselves. Johannes Elliot Østrup, if I had given that talk, a Danish researcher, the first professor of Islamwissenschaft in Denmark, also in the late 19th century, he finished his habilitation, and before he became a professor and didn't have a tenured position, he decided to ride horse from Cairo to Copenhagen. And he became one of the first Westerners who mapped parts of the Syrian desert. And in his travel description, he says, the greedy Europeans, the French, the Brits, he actually says, the Brits who buy these Palmyrene portraits that are torn out of their in-context environment for a few petty francs. And then he goes on to buying a couple of them himself, of course. But I mean, he doesn't talk very nicely about Brits and France. Yes. So, so that's my answer to the predatory about how these people even saw it themselves. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Lara.
Thank you so much for bringing all of this together. I have a question about cities and predation and economies, because one of the things that's striking to me about the way that Rostovtsev is thinking about cities in the context of southern Russia when he's writing his like Iranians and Greeks, and also in his scholarship that he wrote before he left Russia, is that he talks about the mercantile city, right? And that the base of the later Russian urban form is a mercantile city, not an organic city. And I wonder if you've seen him carrying that type of discourse into the earlier work, because I think it's something that I've always wondered whether that's where he's getting caravan cities from, kind of. But I just wonder whether you see it in the other the other work that you've read of his from the space.
See, I didn't set out to do this research to write. I didn't want to write anything about Rostovtsev, actually. I think that plenty has been written about him, and that, he's another one who should be shelved a little bit together with Max Weber. But then, for coming across these unpublished lectures, there was just so much of his early thoughts, and maybe like unpolished thoughts about what cities do and what sort of trajectories they create, and the war and the economy and the conflicts and all these sorts of things. To be quite honest, I haven't read all of them yet. I've just shown you some of the things that I think is really point and make sense for me in the context of Gerasa. You will probably find it in those lectures in a much more rough way than what he polishes up to be publishable later. And that's
It's very milquetoast.
Yeah.
But you feel like there's something else going on.
Yeah, certainly. In 1922, yes. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should stop there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
So I've already introduced the respondents. You've already heard them introducing speakers today. But there was a moment when I was putting this together, and I had just come back from a conference that was really wonderful, and everybody was really interested in what was being said. And the last paper was given. There were 3 questions, and they said, "Okay, thank you very much," and then and of course the conferees went on and had a wonderful dinner where they continued the conversation. But the rest of us were just sort of sitting there mouth agape and wondering what we should do. So it seemed to be a good idea to have these 3 brilliant people offer some thoughts on what they have heard today. So I think, as we were just saying, we can go in order, but this is this is not meant to be a final word. Your thoughts. We'll start with Lara and go down the line, and then we can just have a conversation with the whole room. Yeah.
Sounds good. I do have to say that to continue on the metaphor of yesterday of the spaceship, I feel like the alien from the farthest galaxy, which is the pre-colonial Caribbean, and then also working with soils, a completely different type of material culture, if we want to think about it. But I think, at least in my session, but this also came up in other sessions, it was very interesting to think about this quiet evidence of connectivity, as Lara talked about in hers. And to me, it really reminds me of like how we oftentimes encounter non-evident evidence of what people were doing in spaces. And I think plants in many ways bring up that sort of, those stories, they bring up to life when you start looking at this particular material and all the entanglements around it, but also what it means for it to be in this particular space and time, but what it meant in terms of connections between people, the conversations that must have happened in order for that plant to exist where it did, and to move across such vast distances. And in the Caribbean, and I think I'm gonna do this a little bit too much in the conversation, but I always try to think, how can I learn from others, compare, to understand better my own context? And there's a little bit of envy for this ancient world, because you have so much textual evidence from which to draw from and understand a little bit of what people were thinking and what they were doing. And then in the Caribbean and the pre-colonial Caribbean, we don't have such types of information. So we have to kind of get creative. And for example, for us, some of the latest reframings that we're dealing with now, right, is the introduction of agriculture, of horticulture, where it comes from, how far back it really extends. And we see that the evidence comes from plants, from starches specifically. And Puerto Rico is one of those places where we have some of that early evidence. And just from this little starch that, you know, some archaeologists analyzed and saw like, oh, this is domesticated maize in the middle of Puerto Rico in a cave, and it's dating to 4,000, 5,000 years before present, so about 2,000 years before the conventional frameworks had established that agriculture had reached the Caribbean. Then that little starch opened up the door for just thinking about what it meant in terms of people moving their entire traditional knowledge from northern South America, from the Orinoco region, traveling with plants, traveling with animals, traveling with tools to transport just that plant, right? And then what that meant in terms of understanding this landscape, this island landscape that is very similar in terms of climate, perhaps soils and some processes, but it's also foreign to what they're seeing, to what they're used to. So yeah, to me, again, the non-evident evidence that just opens those doors to think about those relationships in the past and very much make them tangible, right? Like you can tell then that people were here and they were actively managing this landscape. They were not just passive actors on that landscape. And that's what really has propelled a lot of the work that I do now, trying to find more of the non-evident evidence in those soils and question it and think about what that really meant in the past and how that connects us to the present as well.
Well, I'll continue. I too feel like an alien. Disciplinarily, I'm an art historian and I work on pre-modern South Asia. So to be having these discussions with archaeologists, it's I think one of the boundaries that I've crossed is the one of comfort, as we were saying earlier. So we've been talking about various kinds of boundary crossings or border crossings, but I think I appreciate that you've put us in this position where we do feel uncomfortable, and what can we do with that discomfort? So I've actually prepared some remarks. I know that we've all been listening to a lot of talks, but I promise this is on the short side. And I thought it would be useful to do this because I think, as Joan Didion says, how can I know what I think unless I write. So, it did help me to sort of write out my responses to all that we've been saying over the past day and a half. So over the past day and a half, we've made various radical propositions about how we might write more expansive histories of the distant past. We've proposed breaking disciplinary, national, regional, linguistic, and other boundaries, and have ranged widely in time and in space. And that's nothing, I'm not saying anything radical. We've been here these past day and a half. And we've ranged well beyond the portmanteau term, Greece and Rome. I love that. I like that portmanteau term, and we've ranged well beyond that portmanteau term, Greece and Rome. And so John called these overrepresented histories, implying, of course, that one aim or ambition here is to get at those underrepresented or unrecorded stories and peoples and things, which has certainly been an animating impulse of my own scholarship on makers and their resources in Deccan India. So I'd like to pick up a couple of threads from last night's non-keynote conversation. And I'm also taking my lead from John's subheading for the conference, News Stories of the Distant Past, with an emphasis here on the term story. So I'd like to propose that another boundary that those of us working on the distant past can apply pressure on is the narrative boundary. So besides transcending disciplinary boundaries and working between people and places, which was something that came up last night, we also need to transcend writing modes and writing genres and break down barriers between nonfiction and fiction, nonfiction and poetry, nonfiction and song, nonfiction and legend, and even, I would argue, history and the personal narrative. The eminent scholar of South Asian literary cultures, Narayan Rao, writes, quote, contrary to popular opinion, it's fiction that has only one version. So he says it's fiction that has only one version. A factual event will inevitably have various versions depending on the attitude, point of view, intent, and social position of the teller, unquote. And again, I think all the papers we've been hearing have demonstrated that really well. Rao was, of course, writing about the staggering plurality of the Ramayana epic, which was first written down around 500 BCE in Sanskrit, circulating orally for a millennium before, and living a rich and multiple, heterogeneous and polyglot life ever since and into the present day. So what I'm saying is that we have much to learn from the tactics of fiction and storytelling in the histories we write. Our writings can also take from the strategies of poetry and song. In other words, let's make room for the imagination, for the music of language and rhythm and repetition, which is also there in the title of the conference. Reimagining is part of. So I think engaging with the imagination and engaging with like the tactics of literature. So one of the problems I've wrestled with in relation to the histories of histories of the South Asian temple is their isolationism. And this isolationism comes from the very language that structures knowledge transmission, namely the dense Sanskrit vocabulary that scholars use to describe the temple, its components, and their interrelationships. This specialist and jargony language keeps both specialists and non-specialists scholars at arm's length, let alone the broader public. And this is another thread that we were discussing last night. Of course, the scholarship is in part a response to the racializing, colonialist, and orientalist baggage that it has inherited. So I'm not denying the importance of recovering indigenous terms from Indic sources and understanding the workings of Indic architecture from the writings and experiences of those who made and circulated in these pre-modern buildings. It's also important to acknowledge that the vocabulary excavated from South Asian sources not only contains beauty and metaphor, but also culturally specific values and information that an English equivalent may not capture. And again, I don't think we would deny this, and this kind of, this came up again in discussions today. So let me expand further with a teaching moment. I'm currently teaching a graduate seminar at Columbia called The Temple in South Asia, and one of the core questions we ask every week of the books we read is about teachability. Each week we read a temple history, usually a first book, a monograph that's been transformed from a doctoral dissertation and published by a scholarly press. So some of the questions we ask are, can parts of this book be assigned to an undergraduate class, for instance, a class for graduate students? To what extent does the book make its stakes clear to a non-specialist audience? In other words, why does it matter? Why should I care? Why should the students care? Why should this kind of general public that we're trying to engage with care? As many of our speakers emphasized last night, there is a hunger out there for the stories of the past, for histories of the Mauryan Empire, for histories that describe how life was lived in ancient Egypt or ancient Nubia, how ancient people dealt with and commemorated their dead, and so on. And yet, at least temple histories of South Asia, which is again where I've been located, are not reaching non-scholarly audiences, the curious and engaged and hungry potential consumer of these histories. Most of the scholars who produce these histories have been trained in the West, are located in the West, and write in English. For the most part, we could argue that the audience for these books is other scholars and perhaps a limited group of students. So it seems like we're talking to ourselves, and that's something we could say about a number of disciplines, and we could say that about certain literary forms. For instance, poets are often accused of just speaking to other poets. Like, who's reading poetry? Well, only other poets are reading poetry. You're just writing poetry for one another. So if an earlier generation of scholars perpetrated epistemic violence and told distorted, racialized, or Euro-centered histories, then I suppose we're committing the crime of continuing to silence, to erase historical peoples and their stories simply through the narrative inaccessibility of our findings and the way we communicate knowledge. So we've been, again, talking about silences, we've been talking about isolationism, so I'm just picking up again and stressing those threads that came up. Yesterday, my co-panelists, and I think it was you, who mentioned podcasts as a way of reaching more people. Oh, sorry. Joe. So one of my co-panelists mentioned doing podcasts as a way of reaching more people. And I'm finding that there are much bigger audiences for the kinds of work that I'm doing in the Indian subcontinent than in the US, but reaching these audiences means learning to speak differently and to present differently, to engage them through storytelling, and by building on what they already know and what they're already drawn to. These audiences, whether in the Indian subcontinent or here for that matter, do not necessarily care about my critique of style, for instance, and I've been definitely invested in that, or my critique of the North-South binary that sort of structures architectural histories of South Asia. So I have to find the hook, the angle that draws them in. And I suppose the burden is on us, not on our audiences. And I'd say that for the histories that we're trying to write, and I would also address that to producers of literature as well, to producers of all sorts of texts. So besides deploying all of the tactics that literature puts at our disposal, I think it's important to bring in the personal narrative. If you can articulate why you care about what you do, why it matters to you, I think your audience cares as well. So I'd like to sort of encourage us, invite us to make visible the challenges of research. And I think this is something too that sort of came up as a thread in our talks, and especially in the last talk today. So make visible the challenges of research, its many fits and starts, the approaches that didn't work, the changes of mind, the changes of direction, the missteps. Make visible the acts of thinking, looking, and making that go into your history. So I mean, we've been talking about making, but what about the making of histories themselves, and how can we make those visible is something I think that perhaps we don't discuss enough. So I'd just like to close with another quotation from the great essayist Joan Didion, who says, I quote, "I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see and what it means, what I want and what I fear," unquote. So I urge us to show the reader and listener how you think, how you look.
Well, thanks. It's me. I've got nothing anywhere near as eloquent as that to say. Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed the last day and a half. I thought there's a really discernible movement from last night where we blew up everything to today where people were doing the work with scalpels. And whether you prefer to be blown up or dissected is a matter of personal taste, I think. I mean, last night we blew up the nation state and the universities and faculties and disciplines. And I think we blew up books, but I can't quite remember. And doctoral programs and so on. And we were left with a lovely room full of shards and fragments, which we can reassemble as we choose, which was hugely invigorating. Great, thank you. And then today, with this sort of movement that historians and archaeologists constantly do, we move from the global to the local and back again. Suresh Kumar talked about globalization, and we certainly did quite a bit of that today. And I mean, I really enjoyed the sort of what you can get out of thinking about things from the bottom up, sort of not from the top down. And Catherine's paper, what happens if you actually look at this assemblage of material in this context without beginning from a story of Egyptianization or Nubianization or backwards and forwards, and see how much more you get if you think about things in their immediate interim context. And I suppose it's true for the worlds that we study that however big the flows of material and people and mobility and steppe nomads charging around on the backs of ancient DNA across the steppe, that in the end, most history is made locally, and it's sort of, and so that, if you had to reinvent a sort of a buzz line for my response, it's kind of global connections but local understandings. And we kept seeing again and again local understandings. And it came out of Braden's talk as well, this sort of sense of if you really want to understand how things are made, you need to think about the resources, the materials, the people, the landscapes, people moving in and out seasonally. What are the life ways? What are that come together? Not so we don't end up with a great story, but we end up with lots of much more compelling individual stories. And I really like that. I mean, it raises the question of difference. And John encouraged everybody to look for different alternate ways to look at the past. And I think everyone's really risen to that. And I think in different ways, I mean, I loved your talk, Lara, about sort of, unthinking all the sort of narratives of nomads as sort of disruptive people out on the edge who came in and smashed stuff and then disappeared off, the sort of, very Herodotean narrative, isn't it? They sweep in and then you have a go at them and they sweep out, they're gone completely. And again, and instead to think about connected ways in which people exchange goods and things across a huge swathe of Eurasia, living lives that intermingled with the more settled people around them, forming connections. I think you're the only one who mentioned heterarchy, but those sorts of networks, and networks came up several times. So I thought that seemed to so much more compelling a way of thinking about things than the sort of world history of empires type approach, in which, no, we're being recorded, so I'm not going to say something negative about a book that by somebody who's not in the room, but there are other approaches which are much less satisfactory than this. I thought, Rubina, your alternative, your sort of way of taking to bits our understanding, I don't know whether that was what anyone expected from you, because you've done so much in sort of other kinds of urbanism, but watching the city come to bits and watching the excavation be taken apart and seen, again, lived local practices and local knowledges of excavation, and people had to work for excavators and people were dispossessed by excavators. And that was definitely different and alternative. And Manuel, you mentioned a history of the dispossessed, and I thought that's following the dispossessed through history is a extraordinarily difficult but really worthwhile venture to go down. And probably all of us in different ways could think of ways that we look for, not necessarily in a depressing way, but at how big projects fail, how imperial enterprises nevertheless create margins, how cities generate countrysides in which contrary to Rostovchev, life really does happen, even if it doesn't happen in the way it happened in the cities. And these, I find these inspirational. I mean, I know I'm being slightly incoherent, but this is partly because I found lots of stimuluses in the papers over the last few days. But I mean, there's one sort of question which I guess we all have to wrestle with a little bit, which is, how do we put it back together again? Because we wake up in the morning, the university's been blown up, the faculty's been demolished, and all of that sort of stuff. But you still got to go in and teach your Monday morning class. And finely tuned micro-ethno histories are just not going to cut it with the greedy masses. And that's also true of the greedy masses on the end of Joe's podcasts. Because although I agree, podcasts are amazing, and I wanted to put in a word for Neil McGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects, as a how to do ancient history through radio sound bites, which in some ways is another alternative to this. But if we asked ourselves when we've done all the sorts of, are there other ways to reassemble a sort of a history? What is time's arrow? Given that antiquity isn't a static place, and several people brought this out, that there isn't one thing that happens in antiquity, and we carefully avoided debating what antiquity is, but I'm pretty sure no one went much beyond the Bronze Age backwards, and I'm pretty sure we sort of stopped somewhere in the early modern period, mostly medieval. If medieval is a global category, most people think it isn't. But yeah, things change in that period. And what changes? And I mean, there's one thing that very definitely changes is that at the very largest possible scale, there's more people around at the end than the beginning. And that's got to change things. And so I thought one thing that I thought came out really beautifully from your talk, Manuel, was that violence changes, that the kind of violent episodes you were looking at in the middle of the last millennium BC are not the same kinds of violence that we see when violence is coordinated on an imperial scale. You chose the Roman Empire, but one could imagine this, the inner Asian frontier of China, or any one of these other things, or many new world ones. So there is an arrow of time there somewhere. Violence is different when there are more people about, as well as when there are more technologies about. So maybe there's an arrow of time there, and Ian Armitt as well has written beautifully on violence in prehistory, as has Ian Morris and others. So there's definitely a story there, and the paper the first paper we had today is Suresh Kumar's paper, how to write an accumulative story of the Afro-Eurasian world, which is based on plants rather than people. And it was an extraordinary story you began to tell us. And there's obviously many more bits of stories to tell. And what would have been sort of a footnote in most books, and probably ignored in most books, was central to your narrative. And I thought that too is an amazing story, because we're looking, somebody, I can't remember who mentioned the Columbian Exchange, but probably you did. But the sort of, we're not necessarily looking at a history of human beings alone, are we? We're looking at a history of humans and plants and landscapes and animals, and how these all changed. The rise of the cow and the rise of the chicken. These sort of stories which are also part of alternative arrows of time. And the disappearance of so many, because someone said Manuel's story is a bit depressing, and he's right. It's kind of depressing to hear about all the people being murdered and slaughtered. And you had Suresh Kumar, you had a really positive story, which is all these sort of things going around. But of course, if you'd gone on a little bit further, a lot of these flowers and plants would have disappeared and been removed by monocultures or by more domesticated regimes. So, there's another way to tell these stories, following on from Crosby's vision in the Columbian Exchange. And then the story of how we make what we do and where it comes from, where it goes to. And I thought, Abidemi, you brought us both the intense importance of local context, but also this sense of how are we going to write about how we as a species learn to make things in a way that's much more plausible than old sort of diffusion or ex oriente lux narratives. And I really was fascinated. I have a student, in fact, who's writing about glass in Celtic Europe, which is all comes from nature and glass from Egypt. And I just thought, gosh, there's so much more I do not know about the history of glass. But I know a tiny bit more of it thanks to you. And those stories of accumulating technologies and forms and making practices over time, making practices back to Braden's talk. So I've learned a huge amount from all of those things. So there's no one route, is there? I mean, I think Subhashini, you're absolutely right. There's no one factual narrative. Or Joan Didion, or I've forgotten who you quoted on this, an expert on Southeast Asian literature. But we don't need a new grand narrative. We don't need to say the history of the world is now the history of bananas, or the history of body trauma, or the history of metallurgy. But we've been given so many interesting new ways to think about the arrow of time and what happened in history, to quote Gordon Childe. Thank you.
But we do have to come up with a way to communicate this all really, really well. I mean, that's something that I heard in all three of your responses, and I mean, and I'll be self-referential for just a second. The book that I finished that sort of prompted me to want to have this conversation is essentially one of the conclusions that comes out of it is that Roman is not the right categorization for the materials that I'm discussing. And of course, the second that I say something like that to my colleagues, they say, okay, so then what do we call it? The second I say that to my students, to anybody, to my parents, so then what is it? We can't just take away the narrative. We have to supply something else, and we have to do it in a way that is accessible, that is enticing, and frankly, starch is that's a way. I mean, I think honestly, the way you put it, as you know, this single thing that is in its own way so small and barely traceable, opens up a whole new narrative for our understanding of crop cultivation and the Caribbean. So, I mean, I think returning to Joy, a point that Joy made last night. We have to think boldly about how we're going to communicate these narratives. We have to, Subhashini, as you were saying, that we have to find ways that are enticing to everyone if we're going to be heard outside of this room, if we're not silencing histories by just talking amongst ourselves. I look forward to hearing everyone out there in the audience explain to us how we're going to do this. I finished a conference one time, and we moved into another room where there was, I mean, a conference table the size of this room. It's the only time this has ever happened, and it was fantastic because then everybody really felt like they were part of the conversation. So imagine there's a big conference table, and
or actually just come closer. I mean, this happens in my classroom. I'm constantly asking students to come closer, and people want to hide in the back. Thank you. Wow, they're listening.
They listen,
wow.
yeah.
I have authority. I have to remember that.
You're up here with a microphone, man. You're up here with a microphone, yeah.
I know. Wow, that's all I need.
So what are we going to do? Yeah, Joe.
Thank you. So actually, I feel really optimistic after this conference. I think this kind of event is one of the ways we put things back together in a bigger and more interesting and more informed and more contextualized way, precisely because we're talking to each other. In fact, I'm going to push back against the idea that we need to primarily all the time have talking sort of outside the room. Because actually, I think we can only get one reason, and it's not the only reason, it's not the only kind of right reason, but one reason is that I think we can only get to the kinds of exciting ideas and stories and new narratives in a very broad sense if we're getting the ingredients for that from and the theories and the non-narrative approaches from each other first. You know, I think there are many of the people in this room have written extraordinary books, often highly theoretically informed and sophisticated and extraordinary, that will never make the New York Times bestseller list, because actually they're not what people want to read on the beach. I mean, they're what I want to read on the beach, but they're not what normal people want to read on the beach. But without those books, none of us would be here, right? So I think we need to kind of really focus as much as any of us have the inclination or talent on making those connections at all sorts of levels with people outside rooms like this. But it's always got to be at least as important as what's happening inside these rooms. And what's happening inside these rooms now, and this is maybe one of the best examples I've seen of it, is people telling local stories to each other and therefore understanding what they're doing better. And so I basically think this is perfect and you're all wonderful.
Yeah, that was a pretty good answer, I will say. Yeah.
Just to follow on what you said and how important conferences are. Last year, I came to the Eric Klein book talk, and it set me on a journey that ended up last month in Egypt, in Jerash and Petra, and it sent on the beach, not quite on the beach, on the porch, but reading and understanding and coming from a business background, liberal arts background, it was just enthralling to hear these conversations today and sort of think, where is it going to lead for next year? And I think by making this accessible to people outside the academy, people who are interested and curious and sort of excited by seeing these things, you're doing a wonderful service to the rest of us who aren't in your world. So thank you.
To follow on to this, I think what I really struggle with, and I would love to hear Joe's opinion on this and everyone else's, is we're kind of really fighting for the value of uncertainty here, I guess, and the space for telling different stories, different things that can all be true at the same time. And I believe deeply in this current moment that can actually be really helpful to society if we can find a way to kind of get away from this need for certainty and what happened and when and tell me exactly how it was. And I guess for me that it's that uncertainty which is so exciting about what we do, but it seems to be so ingrained in so many of for people outside the academy that certainty is a good thing and something to be desired, and this structures so much of what they think the past should be about that I really struggle with how to kind of communicate that excitement in productive and effective ways. So I would love to hear other people's reactions or experience with that.
I mean, I think on some level we need a podcast that is just all of the stories, and we just need to start populating it. And it needs to be experts who can. I mean, this is in addition to the conversations that we have between each other, because I agree with you, Catherine, that having each of these local or giant, multi-continental perspectives present at once is what is, and not one of them winning out, right? Not one narrative being the right one, not one story leading to the next, but having all of them being present as much as the other and unendingly, yeah. Casper, was your hand going up? No? Yeah. No. Okay.
I'm hidden behind, so sorry about that. The word Joan Jarrow would have used is ambiguity, and I think that's a profoundly feminist commitment that we can be part of as studying the past. And her work I always return to as just really profoundly inspiring about celebrating the ambiguity that the past provides and how we can't settle on particular narratives. And I was struck by Lara's opposition or comparison perhaps between sedentary and nomadic thought earlier on, and how if we can encourage each other to think nomadically, to be on the move, to be flexible, to oppose the kind of rooted, sedentary, tree-like forms of thinking that have dominated our disciplines, and actually embrace the kind of rhizomatic ways of thinking that emerge nomadically, these kinds of conversations can also then encourage really different experimental forms of practice. And that's sometimes how you can reach out to people like, I don't know that we're experimental enough. And that actually goes to really what you were saying, I think, about the forms of writing that we do and where are the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction. Where is the space for speculative fabulation, in Hartman's terms, for example, in our narratives about the past? That image of the sword that's just above John's head there, that's from one of the projects I'm part of, that always captures people. And not necessarily because of what it communicates scientifically, because it just looks really cool. And in a sense, little things like that you produce without any intention of doing it as a public outreach thing, we call it the disco sword on the project, opens up a gap for conversation, which encourages new forms of movement, new kinds of collaboration, new kinds of outcomes. And that, I think, that willingness to be nomadic, that willingness to experiment, that willingness to take risks in how we communicate is going to open up possibilities for new forms of thinking amongst ourselves and I mean generally collaboratively with our different audiences, where they too are actually contributing to the act of thinking that we're doing. Look, just as we always talk about thinking with our students and those teachable moments that we get, thinking how that works with much broader ranges of the public as well, and how we can maybe take more risks with how we talk to them about our work and what it is. Because I think actually what we do is much more exciting than we normally present to the public.
Can I jump in? I want to second and pick up your thought about the experimenting with new forms and what you were saying as well. A long time ago, I wrote a paper about Roman Republican first century BCE engagements and preoccupations with Greeks doing philosophy 300 years before as a kind of mode of fan fiction. And I had been really struck by really two things about fan fiction on the internet. Three. One, that it's global and linking people globally, and not just in English either, because if you go on Archive of Our Own, which is one of the biggest sites, there are dozens of languages there. And second, that it's incredibly scholarly often and documented and careful, and people kind of pick apart, well, you can't tell that story quite that way because it doesn't fit the canon, and they use words like canon, right? And thirdly, it's self-regulating, and often, the rule is civility. Civility, I know, is a very charged word, but I mean, people are not aggressive. It's not Twitter or X or whatever we call it. I guess I want to put that together with Reddit and a site I just happen to know. I'll just use it as an example. At the CUNY Graduate Center has a site about thinking about the future of graduate education. It's called the Futures Initiative. And what they did was they took their conferences and workshops and put them all online. Like they had people essentially just populate Google Docs. And it's a big dump and it's kind of a mess. But if you know search terms you want to use to navigate it, it's incredibly useful. And it's like kind of Fondation Hart approach to those little dialogues they have at the end of presentations. So I think there's a lot. Fundamentally, I think academics, the university, we have not come to grips with technological possibilities of digital communication by a long way. And so in this particular mode of this question of scholarly communication, I'll end with one more thought. When I have suggested these kinds of formats in groups of scholars, one reaction I do get, typically people are really excited and positive, but the criticism is, but I can't know who the other person is and if they have credentials, right? And that to me is like exactly the reason why we got to do this, because it's it's such a powerful anti-gatekeeping mode. So I'm imagining what would this look like if this were all a big doc. I don't know if it's possible to transcribe everything and.
I think we have to for accessibility. So yeah.
Well, it might be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, just two thoughts, not very theoretically elaborate, but I have, over time, I've come to appreciate that sometimes starting stories with just something about one's personal background, or I think Daniel, for example, did an excellent job yesterday introducing a thing about his own childhood or what his father said or so. And that usually works very well with people. I mean, it works well with myself. Sometimes what I really remember very well when I was an undergraduate student were certain anecdotes that professors told me also when they were students, or what somebody told them or so, or what a farmer told them. So these things are sometimes easier to remember. It's something that people can connect with you, and it's a good starting point. It's not the end of the story, but it can be, I think, a very powerful starting point. And often we don't do it because we think it's not so academic, we need to be very serious or so. But I think it's very important to introduce this human component. And also in terms of the new modes of communication, well, not that new, but I think that can be explored more. For example, my friend Felix Stockhammer developed a video game for teenagers in Germany to learn about the Bronze Age. It's called Bronzeon. Everybody can play it, and it was a big success, actually. And it's a way just how do you make high school kids just learn something about Bronze Age in a way they enjoy. And he actually got a prize for it. But it's something that is often, once you have done it and it's successful, it's great. But coming up with the idea and sell it like, okay, I'm going to spend some of my research time doing a video game, no? And how that is perceived sometimes by other colleagues. So obviously there's a lot of scope to engage with people. And also somebody mentioned it today as well, building up, trying to connect with something they know. It doesn't need to be much, but sometimes just keywords or so, building up on that, and then you can tell stories.
Well, I mean, no, now you have a question.
No, it's a comment. So I unfortunately missed last night. I have my Google Calendar set for 7 p.m. for some reason. I was really excited all day, but I'm completely wrong. One thing, though, when I was listening to the lectures today, which I really, really enjoyed, one thing that came back to mind every now and again is past futures. I always felt that as archaeologists, we have a tendency to introduce terms or classifiable phenomena like metallurgy, pottery was today, predation came up, that sort of make us the future of the past, that we work kind of with a very firm definition of what something is, and that takes the real futures out of the past. So, and I think for this sense, also, the craftsman has become something really useful to think with, because craftspeople always have to deal with uncertain futures. They're in the process of discovering what refraction is, for instance, that came up today. And they're always dealing with unknown objects or unknown substances and unknown kind of situations they have to explore. And I think that's really a way of reintroducing or reimagining stories, that, stories in the past can always turn out differently. They can always be different to what we think should have happened in order for the past to live up to our imagination of what the present should be like, if that makes sense.
Terminology can really lock us in too much, I think. Yeah.
Well, I guess I wanted to build on the question of ambiguity, and also talk a little bit more about writing and writing modes, which we've been talking about. And also because I've been reading books on textiles, I wonder if the metaphor of the collage, of the patch textile, or like a quilt, or something like that would be useful when we think about writing, because, and also the fragment and the shard would be useful as well, because I don't think we need to draw strict lines between these modes of writing, but how can how can the way we communicate knowledge, how can the way we express ourselves sort of incorporate strategies from multiple modes or genres as a kind of quilt or a patched garment, if you will. And I wonder if that can be helpful. So yeah, we could include the personal narrative and the anecdote, but that doesn't mean that this is not deeply researched, that that we are not communicating kind of the sophistication, the complexity that we would in a forum like this. And one last thing also is that a forum like this is extremely heterogeneous. I do not assume that just because I'm speaking to another South Asianist, even another South Asianist who's interested in temples, that I can assume a common vocabulary, that I can assume a kind of common understanding. So I don't proceed from that ground. Like I proceed from the ground that, okay, there's some amount of kind of explaining and introducing that I have to do and build on a common ground. So whether it's a scholar or someone in the public, I think that's a productive way of proceeding.
I'll continue on with that because another thing that I thought about listening to the talks today was the multivocality of the archaeological record. And this is something that we talk about, at least that I like to talk about in my class and to exemplify to my students. And I think it was very helpful also today to have some examples of how that happens, especially with the Nubian versus Egypt, right? Like this concept of ethnicity, like how it's really not useful to understand what's happening here. And on the one hand, like maybe it's because I haven't had the chance to read that much. I've finished my dissertation not that long ago. So, I am constantly looking for examples of these instances where these big categories that are meant to be diverse, they end up being boxes also that we end up putting. In gender happens the same thing, right? Even if we try to be open with gender diversity, we still like, how is it that we end up putting these artifacts into these categories? And to make it very clear for students, I really think I take very, very seriously like teaching. I think more than even going to dig and doing the research and publishing, which are all very important, I think teaching is really one of the bigger forums that we have. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the university, but I mean, whatever happens, I think it's an institution worth fighting for, a space worth fighting for, especially at a time when new generations, like different generations, are actually finally having a seat in the classroom. But to bring in these examples and really like be able to guide students through how is it that this particular person got to this conclusion and why is that a different method or process than what happened before. And I think that's part of the reimagining, right? And as well, working with communities, and I know we talk about working with communities, it has been going on in our archaeological circles for decades. It's nothing new, but I think each of us has only our lives, and we're only living it one day at a time. And oftentimes, like, we're encountering the same challenge that we've read about or heard in a podcast, but now you're encountering face to face. So how do you go about like tackling that challenge or living through it? And that's always gonna have a different, it's gonna lead in a different direction, right? And it's gonna make a difference in that particular space time that you're at and participating in, and with the people that you're engaging with. Like, just a brief anecdote, like in Puerto Rico, when I was doing my research for the dissertation, and I'm looking at soils, so it's like the farthest removed thing that people could associate with archaeology. And I would start explaining to people like why I'm doing what I'm doing, looking at this section and at the characteristics of the soil and describing it, and then what my ideas are about how a landscape looks like and why once people come in, we can conceptualize them different, no longer like this empty space. People really get it, like really easy. I don't have to give them a 50-minute class even, like in 10 minutes, they absolutely got it. But at the same time, I was like, who's gonna, like what community, who's gonna care about these soils that I am very fascinated about? And I just kept on going and connecting with people to do my research, and all of a sudden the community found me. And they're like, oh, you work with ancient soils? And I'm like, yes, this is a paleosoil, et cetera, et cetera. And they were like, this is our ancestry, this is our roots, this is so different from the narratives that we've been told, and this is important. It's important that you tell these stories and that we have this scientific, like a new narrative written with more science done. Because this is not what I was taught in school. And I'm like, yeah, it's also not what I was taught in school, and it was just by chance in many ways that I had the opportunity to think about it differently. So working with communities, and yeah, just, we don't have to reinvent the wheel in so many ways either, right? Like, again, these challenges, we have to live through them, but the people that we're encountering, they're new in the broader schemes of the world. And so, yeah, let's go back to the communities. And again, with the multivocality of it, that's also where we're gonna get different stories, where we're gonna get different ideas on how to communicate it, on how to create spaces, on how to move the knowledge around. And all of a sudden, it also kind of lifts that, the burden of feeling like as academics that we have to do it all, because the community, I'm working with an organization called Art Soil Being, and they already had the whole machinery working, and I just had to bring in my tiny expertise on ancient soils, and that's it. And they have it all going, and I all of a sudden feel like, oh, great. So they care. I have this space to tell these stories, and they can also create new stories, but I don't have to be like the one, like, opening all these gates and making sure that there are meetings and this and that. Like, I get to do my work and then also set aside time to be present with my community.
So it's sort of like it's a multivocality and a distributionality, different ways to distribute the different voices or the different ways that you're trying to communicate. And this kind of butts up, I think, against something that Joy, you brought up last night, which is that in order for this to work, particularly for untenured faculty or for contract faculty, we have to change university structures in a big way so that, I know that there was a project that I really wanted to do as an untenured faculty member, and I had the wherewithal to know that that's great, but not going to do it because that would be the end of my career. I wouldn't get tenure, and so luckily, 7 years later, it was still a project nobody had done. So I've gone back and started to do it, right? But we're how do we allow space in our institutions for this kind of multivocality, because I think a lot of people would like to do it. A lot of archaeologists would like to actually spend more of the time after the excavation working with the community that's there around the site to bring it in, but that's not what is ever going to be rewarded in the system that we have. And not just rewarded, that's not what's going to sustain your life and your profession. So the big sort of challenge, or a big sort of challenge, will be tackling that. You want to help? We have like 4 more minutes, so if you have, we can probably stay in here longer, but if there's anybody who has that question that they wanted to ask somebody, now is your last chance. Probably not the last. All right, well, in that case, we'll all get out of school early. I want to take just a second to thank, again, all of the speakers, those who came down from the northern parts of Manhattan, or from the northern parts, or who came from as far away as Singapore to be here to share their wisdom, who have been sharing their thoughts with each other, with me, for all of this time. I have had truly the most enriching year in talking with all of you, but this has surpassed my hopes and dreams. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone for coming.
And John, from all of us, thank you.